We're going to start out by creating a scene where we're using different emitters to control other emitters. And this can create a variety of really cool effects, and also works directly with the way we can control our collision objects. So we're going to start out by adding in a particle emitter. I'm going to use the HV emitter, and I want to call this emitter main, and click OK. And let's make some adjustments to our settings, and we'll change our generator size to 10 meters on the X and 10 meters on the Z. We change our Y to 0.5, which is going to give us 500 millimeters. And I'm going to increase our time frame and timeline to 500 frames to give us a lot to work with to really take a look at this overall effect. So we'll change the lifetime of this emitter to 500 frames. And I'm going to zoom out just a little, and I want to move our emitter up a little bit higher. And we're going to set up our group. And I'm going to call this, let's just call this group underscore main. And now I want to increase our particle limit to 10,000, even though we're probably not going to be using that many particles for this group. And now I want to set up our gravity for this as well. So I'll go ahead and close this out and select gravity. And I'm going to call this gravity underscore main and click OK. And we can basically use all of our default settings for this, except we want to change our group to group main. And now if we scrub through, we can see our particles falling throughout our animation. And that should be good for right there. And what I want to do is open up the object properties, select emitter main, go to the dynamics tab, and I'm going to reduce the birth rate. So I'm going to reduce our birth rate to 10. And now we can just see a very small amount of particles compared to what we had before. And actually for this effect, I'm going to bring it down even further. And you'll see why once we start creating our other effects. And now we have it set to 3. So we have a very small amount of particles being created. And let's take a look at using these particles that we currently have as emitters for new particles. And it's actually really easy to set up. You can get some very cool effects out of that. So first what we need to do is add in our new emitter. Select particle. We have HV emitter. And now I want to give this a new name. And we can just call this emitter underscore child, because it is going to be the child of our other emitter. Now first what I want to do is just close out our panel. And I'm going to set up the motion options, so we can hit M on the keyboard. And I want the parent item to be emitter main. Now we have a little hierarchy with emitter main, which is the first emitter we worked on, and now emitter child, which is the new one that we haven't set anything up for. And right now we can see just the basic emitter and really no overall effect. So what we need to do is change the options for this new emitter. And we'll open up the object properties, select emitter child, go to the dynamics tab, and we can select the effects emitter option. If we go to particle, I'm going to change our lifetime to our 500 frames. And I'm also going to put this in the same group, just for now. And we're not going to see any major effects, except that it is being controlled by our gravity. And let's take a look at changing our nozzle. Right now our nozzle is set to sphere. What we want to do is select parent emitter. And because the parent object is an emitter, and it is our emitter main, we are now going to use every single particle that we have within that emitter as a new emitter. And because of that, it is going to generate a mass amount of particles. So I'm going to reduce our birth rate at first, which is always a good idea when you're doing this method, just so you make sure you don't crash your system depending on how much it can handle. You want to start with a low birth rate, and we're going to start with 10, because each particle will be acting as an emitter directly to this value. So we want to make sure that we don't have too many particles being created all at once, and we can always increase that rate if we need more. Our particle limit is currently set to 1,000. Let's go ahead and increase that to 10,000, and now we can scrub through our animation. Now we're not really seeing any effects show up right now because the gravity that we have set to this group is affecting our new particles as well as our old ones. So what I'm going to do is actually create a new group, and I'm going to call this group underscore child, and now we have our child group. And now our gravity is not going to be affecting this specific emitter. And now what we're seeing is all of these particles being emitted, but they're staying in a straight line. And they're just kind of being emitted from where the particles are and staying where they're at with not too much variation. And the reason for that is we really don't have a whole lot of force on these anymore. We don't have gravity, and we don't have anything else set up for it. So if we move into some of our other settings, what I want to do is go to motion and increase our vibration, which will spread out our particles. And now as we start to scrub through, we can see the particles spraying out and vibrating the particles outward. We can also see that not every single point is becoming an emitter, and that could have to do with the low birth rate that we have, and also the fact that we're not calculating, and there's a couple of other different things that could be causing that, because it won't always connect directly to every emitter. You will run into some problems where sometimes it won't. I'm going to decrease our vibration to 0.5 so that we don't have that drastic of an effect. But we can see right now already that we're getting a really cool looking scene where we can use these particles. But mainly, we can also see that some of these particles are not directly affecting or showing up immediately. So let's go to our birth rate, and I'm going to increase this to 20 because right now there's a very small amount of particles. And with an increased birth rate, we start to see a little bit more. I'm going to increase our particle limit, which could also be restricting us a little. And let's increase that to 100,000. And we can see that showing up a little bit better. I'll increase our birth rate up to 50 this time. And we can scrub through. And now with that increased birth rate, we're seeing that every single particle is going to be emitting correctly. So sometimes when you're working with lower birth rates, you can run into the problem where not every single particle is going to be generating as an emitter. And we can go ahead and calculate this effect, and that way we have something a little more accurate. And we can just let that continue through the timeline to fully calculate all of our different frames. And if you need to cancel that calculation at any time, all you need to do is hit the control key. And now that that is calculated, when we hit play, we'll have a much faster response. Of course, right now, because I'm recording the screen, it's going to be a reduced amount. And the only way to really see that perfect playback is to actually make a preview. And we'll take a look at that in just a sec. But if we scrub through, we can see a fairly interesting looking animation where each of our different particles is generating but we don't have any forces other than that vibration. So what we can do is set up some other effects to affect those new emitters. And if we want to take a look at a preview to play this back real time, we can first take a look at our preview options. There's a couple of different things we can do. We can set this up to wireframe, which I have set as my default, or we can set it up to normal, which will record color and OpenGL information. The encoding and the rest of these options I'm basically going to leave the default, but you can set up specific settings for this if you want to have a different type of compression, if you want to save your file out, different codecs you can use. You can see that those are available. But basically we'll stick with just those preview options, wireframe, and if we go to make preview, we can now type in what we'd like to do to create our preview. Now there's a couple of different tricks we can do to speed up this process. Right now we have a frame step of 1, and we play this back at 30 frames per second, which is our current frame rate. It will play correctly, but if we want a little bit of a quicker preview that we can actually view at the same speed of 30 frames per second, or have it appear that way, we can change the frame step to 2. And now if I create a preview, it's going to record this information. Since it's already calculated, it'll go much quicker. And with that frame step of 2, I can hit play, and it's going to show us our animation. But technically, this is playing back twice as fast. And that's because we have that frame step of 2 instead of 1. So what we would need to do is bring it down to half speed. Once we bring it to half speed, we can view this at the actual time with half the amount of frames. So we don't need to calculate as many frames in order to view this correctly. What I could also do, instead of moving this to half, is set that back to the full resolution, or the full speed, 1 times, and then change our rate to 15. And that will end up producing about the same sort of an effect. You can see that is a little bit faster. If I hit enter, now we can see it is playing correctly. So now we're playing at 15 frames per second, which is correct since we made the preview at a frame step of 2, which is rendering every other frame. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end this preview, and we're going to go back into our scene and take a look at modifying the new emitter to make it look a little bit different and apply some different effects to it. Open up the object properties, and now we can go to the motion and we can set some other options. Now, one thing we can use is explosion. And if I set this to a value of 1, and now we scrub through, what we're going to notice is that it's all going to be exploding basically from the center of the object. So explosion, in this case, is not going to work like it normally does from each emitter. And we can see that this is not affecting from the center of each emitter, and it's going from the center of the overall object. And that way, everything is kind of spraying off to the sides, and we're not getting a full type explosion. And I'll reduce that amount to 0.5, so it's not so drastic. But basically, we're going to have a rounded look to our different emitters and particles because of the fact that we're working with a child, and it's working a little bit differently. And we can see that overall effect, a little interesting looking. And that might not be what you're going for. So we'll remove our explosion. We still have our vibration on, but keep in mind that we can also use wind, and since we are in a new group, which is our child group, we can set up wind to only affect those new emitters, and that new emitter specifically. So let's go ahead and just close out the object properties right now, and we can see we just have that animation where it was at before. And let's add in a new wind object. I'm going to call this wind child. Click OK, and we're going to change this to our child group. So this is only going to affect our child emitter. I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and open it up within the object properties. And now we see that this is currently set to direction. Vector is going to be 1 meter on the Y, so it's going to be blowing and affecting our particles upward. Go ahead and calculate that. And we're really not seeing that overall effect too much. Let's take a look. And what we want to do is increase the radius, because of course we are just in that small area. And even though we're fully surrounding the emitter object as it shows up within the OpenGL preview, since it is linked to the other object, we do need to make this bigger. We set that to 5, not quite large enough, so we'll go ahead and increase that all the way to 10, which will fully engulf the scene. And now we can see that that wind object is going to be affecting those particles correctly. And we end up with a fairly interesting looking effect. I'm going to increase our radius a little bit more, up to 15 meters, so we can go beyond the normal values. For right now, we have this set to direction, so I could change this to a -1 on the Y, and now we're going to be blowing our particles down. And we can see it looks a little bit different, because it is now matching somewhat with our gravity, and it's kind of spraying out our particles and creating little bursts, which can be a really neat effect if that's what you're going for. We can go ahead and change this to the explosion, and that's going to look similar to having the explosion directly on our emitter. We could also do that rotation on the Y, and now we can rotate around those particles and create a really neat looking effect. We do the cylinder explosion. We can go through and do the donut, which will manipulate those particles. We could also add just a little bit of turbulence, and that'll give us a really neat looking effect. And of course, this is only affecting our second group and our second particles. So you can end up creating a lot of different variations of wind effects. We could set this to vortex, and you can get some really neat looking effects that way. You can go ahead and calculate that, and we can see all of that turbulence just kind of twisting around our different objects, and we get some really neat looking particle effects. So of course we can set up different groups for this and really create some neat looking stuff. Another thing we could do is set another wind object to affect just our emitting objects in our first emitter. So what I want to do is first turn this to, let's change this to turbulence, and now we want to affect not the child, but the main. So if we switch to main, we're going to see our first particles start to move around, and then the emitter following will continue along with that to create some nice little swirls and variations within those falling particles. And we get a different sort of effect. We can see all that showing up and coming down. We can click play, or I can just speed this up and scrub through. And of course we could change this once again. We could use vortex and scrub through there. And we get sort of the same effect, but with a lot more variation. And of course we could also use direction as well. But it's a really cool way just to connect and use our particles as other emitters. Now we can also use collision objects and the way each of these particles end to create some more variation. So let's take a look at that now, and what I want to do is first remove this wind object from our scene. So now we just have those straight falling particles. But let's take a look at another way of emitting our child emitter. And what we want to do is first open up Object Properties, and I'm going to change our nozzle from Parent Emitter to Parent Emitter End. And now when we scrub through, we're not going to see anything show up, and that's because this is now linked to the fact that our parent will be ending. But of course these particles are going to last throughout the whole animation because we set it to 500 frames, so they will not end, and we do not see our particles showing up. So what we need to do is change our lifetime. I'm going to bring this down to 250, and if we drag through, once we hit frame 250, then our first set of particles will start to end, and maybe I'll reduce that amount a little bit more so it happens quicker in the animation. But what we can see is once we get past 150, our first sets of particles will start to basically disappear and end their time, and then the new particles are being created. And we can see that showing up with the blue ones that are not highlighted in yellow. Now we don't really have a lot of force going on, so we don't see those particles breaking up. Let's go ahead and select our emitter child. We're going to go to Motion, increase the vibration to 2. And we're still not seeing too much of the effect. If we create a little bit of explosion, of course it'll be going outward, we can see that at this point it's basically creating one particle for each of its parent particles. So what we might need to do is increase the birth rate. Increase that birth rate to 150, and now we can see that more particles are being created. And once each one of these particles end, the new emitter starts, and we can see them breaking off and exploding into the different directions. We'll increase our birth rate up to 250 to create more particles. And this birth rate does work a little bit differently when we're working with child end rather than it as an emitter of itself. So we can have each of these falling particles almost as if they hit the ground and then explode. And there's a way better way of doing that where we're going to set up a collision. But right now we're just taking a look at the way these particles are going to end and then explode. So one thing I'm going to do is remove our explosion. We'll set that down to 0. And now we can see them breaking up with the vibration. But of course all of these particles are ending around in the same area, so we do want to add a little bit of variation to our lifetime. And I'll do 20. And now we can see them breaking up in different areas. And I can increase that a little bit higher, up to 50, to give us even more variation. And now we have them blowing up in different areas and expanding. And we can also set, as we did before, a new wind object to affect these new particles. I'm going to go into our birth rate for our child and increase that up to 600, which is going to create a lot more particles in our scene. And we can see those showing up and giving a really neat looking effect. And we could also go beyond this, and we're going to take a look at that after I go into our collisions and working with the parent objects. But basically, we could have these new emitters connected to another child and have each one of those become a new emitter. So there's a lot we can do with it, and a lot of expansion beyond that. So what we want to do is use collisions to control the way that our first particles are going to be ending. And I'm going to change our birth rate down to 10, just because we're switching to a new type of collision, or a new type of generating our particles. Therefore, we don't want too many to be created all at once. And we're going to take a look at changing some of these options within the next part. And what I first want to do, before we start working on the next section, Let's go to emitter main, particle, and increase our lifetime back up to those 500 frames, and remove our variation. And now we won't see that second one showing up. And then we can start taking a look at the different collisions and how we can affect the new emitter.